Hi, everyone. Welcome to part two, lecture two of our second half of the civil rights movements. All right. So today we're going to be talking about Latinos and kind of Latino movements in the 1960s and beyond. And so first, we want to make sure we are clear on some vocabulary. So what's the difference between Latino and Hispanic? So somebody who classifies themselves as Latino is from Latin America, or that's where they can trace their family. Whereas Hispanic means connected to speaking Spanish. Some people dislike the term or the identification of Hispanic because you're recognizing the colonization history of Spain. So you're talking about lots of places that are in Latin America that were colonized, or Central America that were colonized by Spain. You might take a second to think about, is there anywhere in Latin America that would be considered Latino but not Hispanic? And the answer to that would be Brazil, somewhere like Brazil, where they speak Portugal. So those words are not interchangeable. They have different meanings. All right, and then Chicano, which is something that probably not all of you have heard of. And this is Mexican Americans, and it is maybe similar to Black Power, so a commitment to justice, but also a pride in who you are. And again, these are Mexican Americans. And I've used the @ sign because that's how I learned it, is a way to create gender equity between men and women. Something that you might be more familiar with is the term Latinx, and that takes gender equality a step farther and is a more modern term to be used. All right. At this moment in time, we see that there are quite a few economic and educational struggles that Latinos within the United States are facing. When it comes to education, something like 75% of them are dropping out of school. That's massive. That's a huge deal. And so that's a major issue and something that we're going to see activists kind of rally around and to try and fix. And then lots of economic struggles. So a lot of working class jobs or blue collar jobs rather than some of the maybe higher paying jobs that are out there. So you're seeing a difference between the experience of Latinos within the United States versus others. All right. This moment in time is we're going to see a massive immigration change in the United States. Not only an increased number of Latinos coming to the United States, but also other groups. And the reason we're going to see that, and this is under the LBJ era, is that he and the legislative branch are going to abolish the quota system that we used in the past. So saying that only a certain amount of people can come in from each nation each year. And this makes it more based off of your relatives. So if your relatives are a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident, it's easier to come to the United States, making it easier for people with certain skills to come into the United States, or those who are refugees from areas of violence or unrest. And so if we think about where the United States is in the 1960s, we're going to see a lot of immigrants come from, or refugees come from places like Vietnam or Laos or Cambodia, because we know we're in the middle of the Vietnam War. You're also going to see a massive increase of people from Latin America, Asia, and Africa. The largest numbers, though, are going to be Mexico and the Philippines. And that is thinking about geography, and it's also thinking about the U.S.'s connection to the world. So Mexico makes the most sense geographically. It's easy to get here, or easier to get here. And the Philippines, just a reminder that the Philippines had been a colony of the United States, so a very close relationship with the United States, an equitable relationship with the United States. And they win their independence in 1946, so right after World War II. And so you're going to see kind of those things connected to why people might come to the United States. If you are Filipino or Mexican American, you might think about how and why did your family come to the United States? Was it a result of a conscious choice? Was it connected to border shifting or other changes? What is it that brought your family or had your family end up in the United States? What is now the United States? All right, so one of the most famous people when we're talking about Latino movements is Cesar Chavez and the Farm Workers Movement. So this is a picture of Chavez, and the union's logo is behind him. There's a movie about Chavez. If you're interested, it has Michael Pena in it that you can check out. It's pretty good. I want you to pay attention to the fact that it is Michael Pena that is playing Chavez Just kind of keep that in the back of your mind for a second. The other thing is there's this letter that I'm blocking a little bit, but it is a letter to J. Edgar Hoover. And this letter, I'm not going to read it to you, but this is talking about that the FBI is keeping track of Cesar Chavez, much like they kept track of MLK and lots of other activists. So, again, the FBI is very much meddling or surveilling what these activists are doing, most of whom are nonviolent, and yet any sort of change is a threat, and the FBI is going to try and crack down on it. All right. Except when we're talking about the farm workers movement, one of the people we always seem to focus on Chavez, but we should also make sure that we're talking about Dolores Huerta. And even the first couple years I taught, I did not talk about her. She wasn't even in the notes that I made kids do. Even though she's essentially Chavez's right-hand man, she's the one that comes up with the phrase "si soy pueda" that the activists are going to use. You might even think about the Obama campaign used something similar to that when he ran as well. Okay, so when we're talking about movements based off of ethnicity or race, we want to make sure that we're also thinking about gender, because you're seeing that discrepancy in the way we remember this history, and the way that these movements are fought. There's not necessarily that equity between gender, even though they're recognizing that because of their race or ethnicity, or whatever group that they are identifying as is not being treated equal. There seems to be a blind spot when it comes to gender. All right. So Chavez is most famous for the Great Boycott. Many of you might know that this is actually connected to Filipino farm workers. They started it. You probably might be very familiar with that if you saw Welga that CO put on, and that some of your classmates were in the beginning of the school year. But Filipino farm workers are going to start the Great Boycott, and then they will ask Chavez to get involved, and so it will grow to a much larger movement. But it's a 5-year-long battle to get better treatment for the workers who are picking the grapes. So better healthcare, better wages, better protections, and all of these different things. And so part of that movement, you're going to see that they're going to do a 300-mile march from Southern California to Sacramento to try and raise awareness and to get that change. There's also going to be a moment where some of the younger activists are tired or frustrated, I should say, that it's taking so long. Why are we not winning? And they're thinking about maybe nonviolence is not the way. Maybe violence is the answer. And Chavez absolutely does not want that happen. And so, inspired, I would say, by Gandhi, he's going to go on a hunger strike to remind his activists and his followers that this is nonviolent and this is the way that we are going to win. So, a pretty powerful thing that he does. All right. I often show a documentary about this, which I should hyperlink. I will make sure that I hyperlink on the bottom of this, about the boycotts. And it does a really good job of thinking about, in a sort of a movement like this, or in a boycott, how do we consider the people that are involved, or who are the people involved? And it talks about that there are oppressors, there are targets, or I would say the main people, and then there are allies. So we think about the main people, and then who are going to be the targets for the oppressor. It's going to be Chavez, it's going to be the organizers, it's going to be the farm workers. They're going to feel the brunt of it. That's why they're organizing. It's why they are trying to get things to change. But then those oppressors, who is it that's going to put that pressure or that oppression on the farm workers? And that's going to be the growers, the people that own the farms, or these massive grape companies, law enforcement that are often in protecting the laws, so the status quo, or they're protecting the growers. And it's actually also the people who are buying grapes. So the boycott is saying, don't buy these grapes, don't buy table grapes until these workers are treated fairly, that they get the things that they deserve, whether it's wages, whether it's healthcare, treatment, all those different things. So don't buy the grapes. Well, if you cross the picket line, if you cross the boycott and purchase those grapes, you are hurting the movement. So in this case, they're considering those people to be oppressors. It's one of the things that I think might be important for you guys to think about. You aren't old enough to vote, but we can vote with our dollars. So maybe you make choices about what companies you buy from, or maybe you have conversations with your family about what companies do you want to support. Okay. Do you want to support companies that are protecting their workers right now or treating their workers well right now? Or do you want to protect and support companies that are not giving their employees hazard pay, that are not providing masks for their workers, are not providing sick leave for their workers? Do those things matter to you? I argue that they should. Right. Or maybe you want to be an ally. Maybe you want to help this movement, whether we're talking about historically with the Great Movement, Great Boycotts, or you're talking about protests today, if you're talking about unions today, if you're talking about workers kind of coming together to try and fight for some of these things today. But during the Great Boycotts, we're going to talk about that students who are participating are going to be allies, who march, who make phone calls, who do all sort of that sort of work, whether it's priests or religious leaders that are going to participate, whether it's people that are boycotting, that are going on these marches, that are doing the work behind the scenes, whether it's the people who are refusing to buy the grapes, which is the boycotters. Sorry, that wasn't very clear. So, for example, I know in my own family, my mom's family, they refused to buy those table grapes, so they participated in the boycott. They would not buy those items until the companies changed their policies, until they treated the farm workers with respect, whether that's wages or other things. And one of the things that actually made the biggest difference is Europe. So there's a lot more, I would argue, successful workers' movements or protections for workers in Europe than maybe we see in the United States. And so Europe is going to start participating in the boycott. They're not going to buy American grapes. So they're helping. And that huge economic power of Europeans also not buying the grapes is going to kind of help push it over the edge and force those farm growers or the owners to negotiate with the farm workers. However, if we're thinking about oppressors or where the government might be involved in this, Nixon is going to put his 2 cents in, and he's going to definitely side with the growers or the farm owners. So much so that he's going to take those grapes that are not being bought by American citizens who are voting with their dollars on what they think is right, and he's going to take them and he's going to send them to Vietnam. So he's saying, I am not with the workers, I'm with the growers. I urge you to think about, what does that look like in 2020? So, for example, one of the things that we've seen recently is in the meatpacking industry. There are quite a few of them where they've had massive outbreaks of coronavirus. Like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of workers have had coronavirus. And these seem to be really unsafe places or hot spots for the spread of the virus. And so they have shut down a lot of these meatpacking industries or these facilities. The president used an executive order to force them back open. Is that right? Is our access to meat, is our meat supply such a big deal that we want these workers to go back to work without protections? Or should we be having a different conversation? So just like if we're talking about the Great Boycott, the president is making a decision. He is telling us who it is that he sides with. Is it the workers? Is it the owners? Okay, what is it? And I would argue right now we see that is with the owners. And what does that mean to us? Where are we in that conversation, or what do we think is right? And those owners too, should they open those meatpacking plants? Okay, or should they push back on the president that it's not safe, that they are putting people in harm's way if they open it? I don't know. These are important questions for us to ask. All right. These are just some extras, some things to think about, or if you're interested. One of them is about when the U.S. government tried to replace migrant farm workers with high school athletes over a summer. Short version, did not work well. And another one is kind of, again, talking about the Filipinos actually started that farm workers movement and don't get the credit that they deserve for the beginning of that movement. And the last one is actually a love story about some student walkouts, and I'll talk about the walkouts at the end of this. But just how these young high school kids fall in love as they are participating and trying to fight for justice. I didn't do a very good job of talking about it on the last slide, but I would argue to think about farm workers in 2020, particularly when we're talking about immigration and we're talking about COVID-19, and if we're talking about how do we make sure that there is food in a grocery store? Are we providing extra protections for farm workers today? Are we protecting them as humans, as also protecting our food chain. Um, the other thing is if we're thinking about immigration, and that should have been on an earlier slide, so I apologize. But if we're talking about immigration in 2020, we know that the current president and the current administration has very much wanted to stop or limit immigration to the United States. And we've seen that during this pandemic, there's been a push and some efforts to close it down even more. The idea that in a pandemic, we want to make sure that we're protecting American workers, that it's our job to make sure we protect them and so to close it down, particularly if we're in a recession or we're heading into a recession. And I ask you to strongly think about that. Is that actually keeping us as a country safe? Is that actually keeping people safe or protecting jobs? Or is there something else going on? Is this an opportunity for him to do and his parts of his administration to just do what they wanted to do anyway? And I ask you to really think about that because we have the highest number of corona cases and deaths by a long shot, a third of the cases as of when I'm filming, and an obscene amount of deaths. Are we worried about other people coming in, or should we worry about where we are as a nation? It seems to be that we are doing a good enough job of infecting ourselves and harming ourselves, that we should not be worried about those that are trying to come to the United States, but really thinking about what it is that we are doing to each other instead. But I urge you to think about it for yourself. All right, so now we're going to backtrack a little bit to 1947. And you're like, Ms. Diedrich, why are you going back and forth? But I think it's actually important to take a second to talk about Mendez versus Westminster. And this is a California case. It goes to the California Supreme Court. And it is talking about education. It's talking about discrimination in education in California specifically. And essentially, we're seeing discrimination or segregation in schools based off of ancestry and what they call language deficiency. And that these children, these Mexican American children, are being denied their Fourth Amendment rights to equal protection under the law. Plus, he's still on the board. And what we're going to see is that this is the precursor to what the Brown decision will determine. And California is going to say that this is unequal. But the lawyers in this Supreme Court, or in this case, I should say, are going to give all of that information to Thurgood Marshall. And he's going to be involved a little bit in the case, but he's going to use that to write a brief for the NAACP. And then he will turn around and use that in the Brown case when he argues that in front of the Supreme Court. So Mendez is helping to lay the foundation and to formulate the argument that Marshall can use to get Brown to be decided in their favor in the Supreme Court. The other reason that this is really, really important is the guy that's in charge of California at that moment, Earl Warren, is going to be the Chief Justice that will oversee Brown. So he's watching these things happen. He's seeing the way the wind is going. He's seeing the way that the country is going. And so by the time he gets to the Supreme Court, by the time he makes a decision on Brown, he as a person and what he thinks is right and wrong has changed. So Mendez is really important for where we get later. All right. This group right here, Alizana, is going to be fighting for land or a return of land. And what this organization is talking about is they're going way back to the Mexican-American War. And they're saying, the U.S. took this land. They promised that it would be protected, that America would pay out essentially for this land, and they didn't. And so we are owed for this land. And they're not successful at getting this land back or being compensated for land. But they're bringing awareness to, once again, that the United States promised something and they didn't follow through, that there's this injustice that is happening. And if we think about that, the first thing that I asked you to talk about or to think about in this unit was wealth inequality. And the land and housing kind of fall in that same category. And so if you are prevented from having ownership of land or getting the equity out of that land or the benefits from that land, that's going to have generational problems. That's going to help create a wealth gap in the United States. So drawing attention to some of these major issues. All right. And then two kind of major activists in the Latino movement is Corky Gonzalez and Jose Angel Gutierrez. And they are really political activists, so not just about social change, but political change as well. Corky Gonzalez is famous for this I Am Joaquin poem, and kind of talking about what it means to be Mexican American at this time. Jose Angel Gutierrez is in Texas, and he's an activist in Texas, and he's really arguing for a different political party or a new political party to kind of fight for these things. And he's also involved in a Mexican American youth organization that is going to fight for change in the K-12 system in Texas, particularly in Crystal City. So some protests there. We do see some electoral victories. We do see that they are pushing electoral politics in a different direction, and that the Latino community in the United States is seen as a political force to reckon with, and that you need to think about their issues, and you need to think about how do you create electoral victories. So both politicians need to pay attention, but also that Latinos under his organization are fighting for those changes and trying to force those changes through the electoral system that might be different from a different sort of protest or boycott or through the legal system. All right. And then we're going to see the Brown Berets, and we might think of as similar as the Black Panther movement, very inspired by the Black Panther movement, and they're going to be more militant than some of these other groups, just like the Black Panthers. And they too are fighting back against things like police brutality, for education rights, anti-war, farm workers, and so sort of all of those things. And one of the things that they're super involved in is something that apparently I'm going to come back to in just a second, so hold that thought about the Brown Panthers. So some more organization. We see Puerto Ricans organize. A reminder that Puerto Rico is part of the United States. So they are really fighting. Those Puerto Rican activists in the Puerto Rico movement and the Young Lords are fighting for rights within the United States. So essentially fighting to be treated equally to other American citizens, not only the island of Puerto Rico, but also Puerto Ricans that are in the main island or in the United States proper, essentially, for essentially education, economic rights, or economic access, some of these similar things. The Young Lords are going to be the more militant group under the Puerto Ricans movements as well. So again, similar to the Black Panthers. In Chicago, the Young Lords are working with the Black Panthers, which I've mentioned in a different lecture, but sort of recognizing similar plights or similar issues in these different groups. It says issues today because one of the things that we've seen in the last couple years is kind of the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in Puerto Rico. How is Puerto Rico treated today? Are they seen as equal Americans? Are we protecting their needs or giving them the resources that they need, or are we treating them differently? And I would argue that we as a nation and the administration did not do a very good job of taking care of Puerto Rico after the hurricane. Quick to provide resources and the things that places like Texas needed or Florida needed after a hurricane, not so much Puerto Rico. Also, some political issues in Puerto Rico. Many people in Puerto Rico would like to become a U.S. state. Well, what is the process of doing that? Would the main United States actually allow that to happen? Because it would have to go through Congress. Congress would have to approve it. It's a complicated thing. All right, Cuban Americans. Cuban Americans are going to be different than all the other groups that we've talked about. And the reason for that is the other groups that we've talked about, a lot of them are concerned about economic problems, inequalities, access to jobs or good economic opportunities, whereas Cuban Americans are coming to America to flee Fidel Castro. So they're political refugees, not economic refugees, if we want to classify other immigrant groups that way. So they're fleeing the Castro regime, and they would like to see the American government get rid of Castro. So there's a major difference between essentially how Cuban Americans identify or how they look at the world or what they think the United States should do versus many of these other groups. And we've kind of talked about this in the last unit, but Cuban Americans are known to vote Republican. Not all of them. I'm not saying all of them, but many of them, because of the failed efforts of the Kennedy administration to get rid of Fidel Castro. And many still harbor sort of that resentment towards the Democratic Party for not doing that. All right, this is what I thought was going to come next. So this is the walkout movement in LA. And I am terribly sad that I cannot show you this film. It's a Hollywood film. but it's great if you watch Spy Kids as a kid. It's the main actress from there that plays the high school student in this film. You can find it online. I strongly, strongly urge you to watch it. This is going to be a shorter lecture. Take some time, try and find some of it. It's really good, and it shows the power of young people. And there are some parts of it that are just really fun. So again, it breaks my heart that I cannot actually show you this film. The other thing I want to point out is this is from the film. That's Michael Pena. So if you had me first term, I spent a lot of time, or we had a probably detailed conversation about whether Hollywood is allergic to Black actors, and I mentioned something about what about other groups, what about Latinos, what about Native Americans, et cetera, et cetera. And I would argue, or I would ask you to think about, how does Hollywood treat Latinos? How many Latino actors or actresses do you know? And maybe connect that to why Michael Pena is the lead in both of these films. Which I'm not saying anything bad about Michael Pena. That's not what I mean at all. But are Latinos as represented in Hollywood as they should be? All right, but back to the walkout movement. These high school students, with the inspiration from Sal Castro, their teacher, who's right here, and that's who Michael Pena plays, is recognizing that there's a lot of inequalities, that they don't go to good schools. They don't have the resources. They are hit if they speak Spanish. They're punished. They have to do like janitorial duties if they get in trouble. They're not allowed to use the bathrooms. They're not trusted. They're kind of steered through to blue collar jobs and away from college. And so these students start to organize. They start to get some information. They try and go to the school board, who ignores them. And so the students start to think, okay, what do we do? And kind of inspired by the movements from people like MLK, from Chavez, from Gandhi, from all of the sort of civil rights movements that happened in the early 1960s or earlier in the 1960s, they say, you know what? Let's do a walkout. Let's do a protest. And in the film, there's this cheesy part where they talk about that this is like they're in the back of the bus, which is cheesy in the film, but essentially it's the film trying to show you that they feel like they are being treated as second-class citizens, or at least second-class students. So, and the reason that they're going to do a walkout movement is this is how they can hurt the school. They know that the school makes money off of their attendance, so if they leave, then the school is not going to get that money. So they need to pay attention to these kids. Much like all these other activist groups we've talked about, the FBI is watching them. There's a coffee shop where they are organizing and they meet is closed. They know there's an informant. They just don't know who it is. And there's a lot of pressure on these kids. Do you participate? What happens if I participate? What are my parents going to do if I participate? Am I going to lose this opportunity? Am I going to get kicked out of school? All these sort of things. And you also have all these high school kids that are trying to figure out what's the answer, and they don't all agree. And there's a school that walks out early because you're trying to get multiple schools to do this. And it's premature. They're not organized. Nobody's paying attention. And the students are learning a lot about what it means to work together and how do you get media attention. How do you get people to pay attention? And how do you prepare for violence? And so one of the things that we see is that the Brown Berets will essentially be the protectors of the students, and they will put themselves between this law enforcement, Brown Berets, and then the students, so that if law enforcement responds, and they do, and they beat the garbage out of these kids, and you can see like the actual footage of that, the Brown Berets are going to take the first brunt of that. They're going to take as much of that violence or that action as they can, and to kind of protect the students from that. And there are some victories that these students make, not as much as they probably would have hoped, but it does urge the schools to go in a different direction and put pressure on the schools to go in a different direction. Some of the major things that we see, though, is that a lot more are going to graduate. And I mentioned at the beginning of this that something like 75% of kids are dropping out. So we're going to see that those numbers go drastically up, so that graduation rates of Latinos now are in the 90s, I believe, and college. So many more of them are going to go to college. And so they don't make perfect change at the schools. You can think about your own experiences at schools where they have lots of room to grow. But for the individuals, there's a lot of opportunity that comes from this. And many of those who participate in the walkout, it also changes their path in life. Many of them will go to college. Many of them will continue to be in sort of activist jobs or social justice jobs, whether that's working for college, whether that is being a community organizers and all of that. These moments change their lives in maybe ways that you can't physically see, but mentally and emotionally, it changes who these kids are. And again, it's just another example of how powerful young people are. Like, they force LA to change. They force the education system in LA to change, and they're your age. They're your age. So I, I, I really urge you to think about that. If you want something to change, you have the ability to do that. You have the ability to force adults to pay attention to you, to force the nation, to force a city, to force a state to pay attention to you. And so if there's something that you care about, you have the power to do something about it. All right. And I'm going to leave it with a message about how powerful you guys are. All right. I will see you all later.